Okay, so let's go into Xero itself and take a look. So for today, I'm going to be using a demo Xero file. You also have access to this demo Xero file. So where you've got your Xero file name in the top left-hand side, if you click on that, you can then choose or go to change organization and choose the demo company from that list. The demo company is free to use. You can do whatever you like with it. It really does not matter. It is your demo file to break to your heart's content. One word of caution I would add with that though is just make sure that if you are doing demo transactions that you are in your demo file first, or if you're putting in real transactions, make sure that you are in your file first. So just a word of warning if you do decide you'd like to move it. Okay, so let's jump straight into the coding area and go through these different coding options. So for those of you who've been using Xero for a while, you'll be quite well used to seeing views like this, where you'll have a bank feed transaction and it's found a match within Xero, and all you have to do is click OK, and it's reconciled. Simple as that. Now, of course, if you've been using Xero for a while, you'd know that that does not always happen. So what I'm going to go through now is some of the different examples of things that you can have happen and how you can deal with them. So the first one that I'm going to look at is dealing with underpayments. Now, this is the one that you would likely have seen or used before. It's a scenario where you've underpaid, or a customer has underpaid, or you've underpaid a supplier, and so you want to put a part payment against an invoice or a bill. So this $100 amount I know relates to a bill which is worth more than that, which is why when I was on my match screen, it didn't come up with a green match, because the green match for Xero will only come up if the amount matches to the cent. If it doesn't match, it won't provide the green match option. It may provide you a coding option, but it won't match it to a bill or a invoice. So in this case, I know this is a payment for City Limousines for this invoice. Now, once I tick this invoice, the word split appears. So split means that I can click on it and go part payment and go split. And what that will do is it will put a $100 part payment against the invoice and update it for the new balance. So that quite simply is your part payments. Now, so that's how you deal with those. What I'm going to go through to next is how to deal with overpayments, or payments for invoices, or payments that don't relate to any invoices in the system. So the first one, overpayments. So there is the odd occasion where clients maybe overpay you, or you overpay a supplier, or something along those lines. What you would do in those scenarios is you would tick off any invoices that you already have in the system, and then you would go down to new transaction. Now, in this example, it says receive money. That's because the money that's being paid, in this case, it's a money coming in transaction. If it was money going out, this would say spend money. Don't worry about the terminology that shows there. You're still following the same process regardless of which one of the two it says. So under receive money, I can then go to this drop-down box here and choose overpayment. Make sure you've got the customer right, put in a description that you need to, and then save transaction. If, for example, that it wasn't an overpayment and they were giving you, they're actually prepaying you for money that for work you've already contracted to do later, you would choose the prepayment option, code it to whatever code you would normally have. Generally, this would be something like deposits received in advance, or prepaid for services, or something along those lines. You would then choose what that is and then save. If it just needs to be coded off to one specific code, so say this was actually your banking for the day and some of it was paying some accounts that you've got, but the rest of it was just sales or takings for that day, you could use direct payment and just code the rest off to sales. Before I move on from here, the key thing I will point out is the difference between a prepayment and an overpayment. A prepayment is money that you have received or paid to a supplier for services that you have already agreed to. So it's something, say you're wanting a new kitchen and you have to do a 10% deposit on it. That would be a prepayment. An overpayment is if you pay someone accidentally more than you were meant to. So say you had an account with a supplier that was $200 and you paid them $250. The $50 would be an overpayment, which they would hold on credit to either pay you back later, or you could use to offset against future things later. The key with that though, is that it's offset against things you have not already signed up for. Okay, so overpayment, mistake. Prepayment is planned and it's for something in the future. So it's part of a contractual arrangement. If for whatever reason, when you're dealing with an overpayment or prepayment or whatever it is, and there's no invoices or bills to reconcile, you can go straight to the Add Details button in the Create tab rather than Find and Match. And then from here, you can choose which of the different payment options it needs to be, and then save. You only need to go to the match screen here. You only need to go to the match screen in this part here if there are invoices or bills to match to first. Okay, so that's overpayments. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to deal with transactions where you have both bills and sales invoices. So this is a scenario that I've seen come up in a few different examples. So what you may have is you might have a contact where you've got sales invoices that you've sent to them, but then they've also billed you for services. And for whatever reason, what you might have done is just simply paid the difference between those two or received the difference between the two. So what that means is you have to do something slightly differently for your reconciling. So I know for this example here that this was a bill that I've paid of $4,500. And I can see here that there are two bills for the supplier. However, I'm out by $100 because there's actually an invoice that I sent to this contact for $100, which was deducted from this payment. To find that invoice, I just need to tick Show Received Items, and now it will bring up not only my bills, but also my sales invoices. I can now search for this particular customer, and you'll see that the ones in red are bills, and also they show in the spent column, and the ones in green are in my received column. Once I tick this off, it will now allow me to match, and once I click OK, it's going to put a payment against each bill and a payment against the invoice, just like if they had been paid individually. Now, the other tick box in that Find and Match view is Show New Zealand dollar items only. If you just have a New Zealand dollar Xero file, so you don't have a foreign currency bank account, you don't invoice in different currencies, and you don't record bills in different currencies, then you will not see this tick box at all. It will just be Show Spent Items, and this part here won't be there at all. If you do have multi-currency in your file, so bank accounts, bills, or invoices, you will have this tick box item here where you can tick this on to just show New Zealand dollar items, or you can untick it and it will show you all currencies. Next thing is dealing with minor adjustments. So this invoice here is a payment. So this payment here is for this particular invoice. Now, what's happened is the customer has paid me $100, but the invoice was actually for $100.50. Now, for the sake of efficiency, we're not going to chase up 50 cents. It's really not worth anyone's time. So I just want to adjust it to make it go away. So first step, tick the invoice and then go down to this adjustments area and choose minor adjustment. And then if it shows as a negative, I need to type this in as a negative. If it showed as a positive, type it in as a positive number. Now, this only works if you are doing less than $1. do more than $1, I'm going to get a warning here that's going to tell me that adjustments should not be more than $1. The reason for that is because this amount goes to an account code on your balance sheet and forms part of a balance that needs to be dealt with at year end. If the amounts are less than $1 or around that proximity and you've got negatives and positives, the idea is they go in and out and eventually they will just clear themselves off, or be a very small amount at least to clear off at the end of the year. If you put large amounts to it, it becomes quite a mess that needs to be dealt with later on. So make sure you keep those adjustments to that $1 range. It won't stop you if you try and put more than $1, but it will give you that warning, which will hopefully prevent you from putting in adjustments that are too large. Okay, so that's minor adjustments. The next thing I'm going to look at is how to deal with bank fees on transactions. So this is something that will be coming up a lot, particularly under level 3 with a lot of people trading online. A lot of online providers, what they will do is they will deposit the money in your account for the sales that you've made, but they will deduct fees from that, which will reduce the amount that you're reconciling. Now, depending on the system you're using, if it's Shopify or some other e-shop version, will depend on, and also how you're integrating that with Xero, if you are at all, will cause differences as to how you deal with the scenario. So there are 3 different versions that I've come across. The first version is all the sales invoices and all the fees on those sales feed through to Xero. So if that happens, you would go to find and match, and you would tick show spent items, and you would search for your sales invoices and for your fees, and you should just be able to tick them off until this amount balances. So that's if both your sales and your sales and the fees on those sales are pulling into Xero. Option 2 is if just your sales are pulling through. So any sales or orders that you make, the totals for those are pulling through. What you'll find is you'll need to go into this area here, tick off the sales invoices, but what you'll end up with is you'll end up with a balance that is higher. So I'll just tick these as an example, that is higher than what you've actually received. So in this example here, I've ticked off all these invoices, which shows income of 2,205, but I've actually only received 2,000. So the way to deal with this, first, do not use the minor adjustment because, like I mentioned before, that's going to go to a sundry code on your balance sheet and cause problems when you're reconciling later. You will go to bank fee. So in the bank fee box, I can put in the 2. Let's see, who are we dealing with? I put whoever it is that I'm paying the fees to on sales. Choose the code that it's going against. Now, you can use bank fees for this code, but there potentially might be GST on those fees. In fact, I think a lot of them do. So what you're probably better off to do is to have a separate code called merchant fees or something else like that, and make sure it's got GST on it. You could technically use bank fees and change the GST to GST on expenses, but I personally don't recommend that because it can often be confusing when you're dealing with that at year end. Really, your bank fees should just be fees from your bank. Any fees from a third-party payment provider should be coded to a separate code with GST. In here, in the amount, I will now type what the fees are. And now that I've done that, it will now allow me to reconcile it. So option 2, your sales are pulling into Xero, but not the fees. Tick off all the sales invoices, go to the adjustments, add the bank fee adjustment to it, or click on bank fees, fill out these details, make sure it's got GST on it, because most likely it will. If you're unsure, check whoever it is registered for GST, or check the invoices you're getting, or if not, talk to your accountant and they will hopefully be able to provide you with that detail. Okay, so that's method 2. Now, method 3 neither of the transactions are in zero, so you don't have any sales invoices and you don't have any of the fees on the transaction in zero. All you have is money that has come in, and that's it. In those scenarios, you'd go to add details, put in the line for your sales. So let's just say that I've received $115 worth of sales. And then yes, I'm just going to use Shopify as this example. And then I'm going to put a negative unit price of $15 to represent my fees that I've been charged. You would then choose whatever fee code you're using. Once again, make sure check whether it's got GST or not. It likely will have. And ideally, you wouldn't use bank fees. You'd use something like a merchant fees code or similar. And then you'd go save transaction. So just to recap those three options. First option, when you're dealing with fees on sales, is if both sales and fees are in your system, you're going to match, ticking show spent items, ticking off the list, and it should then match back automatically. Method 2, your sales orders with the amounts are pulling through to zero, but the fees are not. So in that instance, you would tick off all the sales invoices, go to the adjustments and use the bank fee to then type in that particular fee that you've been charged, checking once again whether it's got GST or not. And third option, if nothing is pulling across to zero from whatever system you're using, then you will go to add details and then fill out all that information in there. Bearing in mind that when you enter the fee line, make sure that you enter the unit price as a negative. Okay, so that's those different matching options. As I say, if there's any questions with any of the things that I've covered or gone through, or anything that you need to or weren't quite sure on, do feel free to fire through questions. I am keeping an eye on those and I will answer them as I can, or I will cover them off at the end. But yeah, fire them through as you have them. And the next thing I wanted to go through is how to deal with the paying of credit notes. So sometimes, particularly if you're dealing with an overpayment, that credit that's created may not be automatically applied against an invoice or bill later on. If you've overpaid a supplier, you might want that money back, or if a customer has overpaid you, they may want that money back. Now, in those scenarios, what you'll need to do is first pay them the money. Then secondly, you're going to have to create a payment transaction within Xero. And what I'm going to go through now is how you do that and why you have to do it this way. So first, I'm going to go to my sales overview. And I'm going to go to my awaiting payment. So here, I've got a credit note here for a customer. They have requested that I pay that amount back to them. So I have gone and I have made the payment, and now I need to match this off in my bank feed. In the credit note, there is an option down here where you can edit or add in the cash refund. Now, in sales invoices, you'll also have a box similar to this where it gives you the option to make a payment. Now, generally, I tell people to avoid that. But for credit notes, you have to use this area because this credit note will not show up as something that you can match in your bank reconcile area unless you create this payment. So it's vital that you do this. But as I say, only on credit notes. So I'm going to choose what date the payment has been made, the bank account it's been paid from. I can put in a reference if need be, but it's not vital. And then add refund. Now, if I go back to my dashboard and click on reconcile, if I then go to money going out, so I'll just pick on one of these transactions. Here is the credit note payment showing ready to be reconciled. Now, if I hadn't put that payment in, it would not be showing up. And that is a protection to avoid the accidental matching of credit notes to bill payments or other transactions. So that is the one time where I tell you to use the payment area underneath the credit note in this case, or invoice or bill. Otherwise, try and avoid that because it tends to lead to all sorts of problems later on. Okay, the next thing I'm going to look at is the difference between bank rules and auto-coding rules. So auto-coding rules, you will have likely have all seen those. What they are is a memorization or machine learning within Xero where it sees transactions that it's had before and fills in the details automatically. You'll know if that's happened if you log into Xero and you look at one of your transactions that's fed in from the prior day and it's already got details filled out in here. If it's already got information filled out, that's an auto-coding rule. A bank rule is a rule that you have set up yourself that will override the auto-coding rule and anything else that you've put in there. This here is an example of a bank rule. So it looks a bit different to the auto-coding, but it's showing that this transaction here is having this particular rule applied against it. And I can go, yes, that rule is correct, and I can click OK, and that will reconcile the transaction. I can do the same thing on the auto-coding. I can check that the details are okay, and then click the OK button. Now, the reason why there's the two different types of rules is because the auto-coding rule does not get things right every time. There is the odd occasion where the rule may pick up the wrong information, or particularly if you're depositing money into your bank account. If for whatever reason, if it's got just generic information, the auto-coding rule might pick that up and then code it incorrectly. The bank rule here is able to override that rule, and it's going to look for specific transaction information to then apply that rule and do it correctly. The other thing bank rules are used for is multi-line splits. So your auto-coding rules will pull up, if you've split a transaction, it will show as, instead of add details, it might have edit 2 lines, or keep as 2 lines, or keep as 3 lines, but it won't fill out each of those lines. It will only fill out the first one. So if you know what a split of a transaction is going to be, you're better off using the bank rules. So let's go in and take a look at a bank rule, and I can show you how it works. So I'm going to pop into this rule here. So there are a lot of boxes in here. The first thing I'll point out is don't be intimidated by it. You just need to work through each step logically and on its own, and it will make sense as you go through. The first step is the critical one. That's the one where you're saying, right, these are the conditions, or this is the information that I want to be used, or what I want to be pegged as the major information that's going to choose whether this rule is applied or not. So in this case, I'm saying that if the payee contains the word 11, I want it to apply this rule. You could also have conditions like I want the amount to be greater than or less than or equals to a particular number. And that could be if you've got different payments to a supplier with 11, some might be higher and some might be lower, and the lower ones may go to a different code than the higher ones. You can have it equaling exactly, or as I say, you can have the greater than or less than. You can add references. You can say the reference contains entertainment or something similar. The key thing is this information needs to consistently be on every bank transaction, otherwise the rule doesn't work. If you're choosing the payee, so the person who's paid you as being one of the conditions, which commonly people do, make sure you choose correctly between equals or contains. If I choose the payee equals 11, if there is any slight variation from 11 being the payee name, the rule will fail. If I use contains, if I click on it, if I choose contains, every time I see a transaction comes through that has the text 11, if it has anything else, that's fine. The rule will still apply. So just make sure that you choose the right one between equals and contains. Generally, my recommendation is to use contains because it is inclined to be the more accurate of the two. So that's choosing your conditions. Secondly, quite simply, you're choosing the contact that the transaction relates to. Most of the time, you'll be going existing or new contact, typing in the name and choosing it from the drop-down. Step 3, you're going to choose or decide if there are any fixed value items that go to one particular code. This step generally is not filled out. This would only be filled out if, say, you paid a set amount for a power bill, and say $50 of that always goes to drawings, for example, and it's always that fixed dollar value. If it's a fixed dollar value, regardless of the total of the transaction, you would use this option. Most of the time that's not relevant, so generally you would skip down to step 4. In here, you would add in each of the lines and you would either put 100% to one code, or you might add in a second code and put 50%. Now, it's not going to let me continue until this equals to 100%. And what I'm saying here is that, okay, 50% of this cost is deductible as an office expense, and 50% of it is private. So the bank rules are great for transactions where maybe you're paying a rates bill or something else like that, and part of it is business and part of it is personal. You can have as many lines here or as many lines here as you need. The key thing at the end of the day is that the percentages total back to 100% and that the fixed value line items don't exceed the value of the transaction. Reference, so this is the reference that will be applied against the transaction when it's coded through. Generally, I would say you don't need to change that because the reference isn't too massive, but you've got a few different options, including the ability to edit it when you're doing your bank rec. You can then choose whether this particular rule applies on one bank account or across all your bank accounts. So if you're doing a rule for bank fees or interest that you might be receiving on your balance, you might choose all bank accounts. If the rule only applies to your bank account that you're in, you would choose the relevant bank account and carry on. The last step, and one of the most crucial, is giving the rule a name. So when you're adding in a rule or when you're doing the reconciling, this rule name is what's going to appear in your match side. So you want this rule to be descriptive and to tell you, or you'll be able to look at it and see, right, I know that this rule is correct. I know that this is applied it correctly. If you give it an ambiguous name, so say you might have more than one rule for 7-Eleven, when you come to do your reconciling, you've got no idea which rule you're applying. So the more information you put in here, bearing in mind you don't want to put a whole paragraph, but a few good, well-chosen words will help make your reconciling much easier. Okay. So just to recap that, auto-coding rules are automatically applied in Xero and will pull up information very much like this. It will not split out multiple lines, but if you've used multiple lines before, it will prompt you down here to say keep as 2 or 3 or 4 lines. If the auto-coding rule isn't cutting it, set up a bank rule, and you can do that by going to the options button beside a transaction and go and create bank rule. Make sure when you're doing that you focus on getting the first step right in terms of how the information is being chosen. So looking at whether it contains or equals in terms of the payee name. And then lastly, making sure you give the rule a really good name, because then it's nice and obvious for you when you come to reconcile what rule's being applied and whether it's right. So that's bank rules. The next thing, transfers. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but if you are using the transfer button, there is a couple of things to bear in mind. The first one probably seems a wee bit obvious, but it is one that I've had come up a few times. Make sure that you've transferred the money first. The transfer only works once you've actually done the physical bank transfer in your bank account first. This is after the fact transaction that you're entering. Secondly, make sure that both accounts that you're using this transfer for are in your Xero file. So I've seen examples where people have used transfer and it's actually been money transferred to their own bank account, and they've gotten confused because they've seen the word transfer in here and then they've seen the word transfer here and gone, oh, that's what I need to do. I'll just click on that and it will be fine. So make sure that if you're using transfer that both accounts are in there. The other thing to note is what I personally recommend you do is when you're reconciling, go through your smaller bank accounts like your savings or your loan accounts first, reconcile the transactions there and use the create transfers from that side, because then when you come to reconcile your main business bank account, it'll come up with green matches showing you all the transfers and all you need to do is click OK. Whereas I find if you create them from the check account, because your check account can often be used to transfer money not only to business bank accounts, but also to private bank accounts or other business bank accounts, it's very easy for the transfer to be accidentally misused in that scenario. So 3 key things: you have to have done the transfer in your bank account first, both bank accounts must be in Xero, and thirdly, just make sure that you create the transactions from your savings or your loan accounts or your smaller bank accounts or less volume bank accounts first, and then your check account should just be a clicking OK to match. Because if you create a transfer from both sides, you're going to have a double up of transactions, one going one way and one going the other. And the last tab here is Discuss. So Discuss is a really great tool if you have an advisor that you're dealing with, or you're doing coding on behalf of someone else and you've got someone else that's checking your work or is logging into Xero. What the Discuss button allows you to do is you can type in a message against any transaction that you aren't sure what to do with. So I can go and say, so I can put in a message like this. I can then, unfortunately, this won't message whoever it is that you may have mentioned, or you can't send those messages to people, which is a bit of a pain, but at the moment you can't do that. But once I've saved the message, I can then go and in this case, I can talk to Bob and say, done all the coding I can. There's a few transactions I'm not sure on. I've left some notes. Can you go and take a look? And it is much easier to say that rather than having to go to an email and saying, Bob, can you look at these transactions on the 27th of April, 7/11, $15.50, I don't know where to code this. The length of time it takes you to type that versus quickly putting it in here, flicking him off a text or email or call or whatever it is, and telling him that you want him to go in and look at the coding is much, much easier. And particularly if you've got a lot of transactions to check, it's a really great way to leave notes. When Bob, in this case, comes in and looks at the transaction, he can click in this box and he can add in, go to office expenses, a note like this, or he can go straight to create and code the transaction. But as I say, great way to leave some notes. These notes do get saved in your history and notes area against the transaction later if for whatever reason you want to dig them up later on. But a great way to communicate if you've got multiple people going into a Xero file or helping you with your Xero file. The next thing I want to look at is attaching documents. Now, for those of you who have been to one of my HubDoc webinars or have seen HubDoc, you won't probably use this attaching documents option very frequently if you're using something like HubDoc, but there are times where you might want to add documents to a bank transaction that you can't add into HubDoc. So this might be contracts, it might be some purchase agreements, it might be other information outside of the invoice or receipt or bill that you may have uploaded to Xero. So to add those details, you can go straight to add details here, and you'll see that we've got the document symbol here, which I can click on. I can either upload it from my file library if it's there, or I can just upload the files from my computer. If you've already reconciled the transaction, if we go to the account transactions window, I can click on any of these transactions and I can attach a document to it. So even if it's a payment, even if you've already reconciled it, you can still go and find that transaction, attach a document to it to store for later. If you're using something like HubDoc, this would only be for, say, sale and purchase agreements for fixed assets, or any other forms of documentation that do not have the numbers on them. That might be in addition, so some sort of terms or anything like that that you might want to attach to a transaction you're entering into Xero. Okay, so that's everything from a coding point of view. What I'm now going to go through is the information about how to deal with your bank rec and some details about some of the different tabs or lists of transactions that you can see when you're looking at transactions in Xero. So from my dashboard, if I click on my bank account name, it takes me to a screen called Account Transactions. Sorry, one moment. Excuse me. So, Account Transactions, these are all your transactions that have been entered into Xero, regardless of whether they have been matched to a bank feed line or whether they've been auto-reconciled or whatever else you've done with them. So account transactions, they form your balance in Xero. Your bank statements are your transactions that feed through from your bank account, and they form the statement balance. Ideally, once you've reconciled the 24 transactions that we've got here, this balance in Xero should equal my statement balance. But of course, that doesn't always happen. But we'll go through the reason why in a moment. But as I say, key difference, bank statements is the information as per your bank account transactions as per your Xero file. An example of where those would be different is if you are using the batch payment process within Xero, where you're paying a whole heap of bills at once, your account transactions screen may show just one line, which would be all of those bills being paid in one big lump. But your bank statement may show multiple transactions underneath. Another example is if you've got one amount coming in for, say, your online sales, you would have one line in the bank statement, but in your account transactions, you could have 40, 50, 60 lines for all your different invoices and the fees. If you are trying to find a transaction that you've already done, depending on the information you have on that transaction will depend on which one of these two it's good to use to find that information. If you've entered a payment against an invoice and you can't find that payment, but you know what the amount was and you know the date or anything along those lines, because the transaction originated from Xero, you would go search in the account transactions area. If I know I received about $2,000 into my bank account on a certain day, but I don't know what happened to it in Xero, I'm going to be looking at my bank statements tab because the information I have relates to the bank, a line that appeared on my bank statements rather than what's in Xero. So the bit that's in question in that case is what's happened to it in Xero. The bit that I have that is certain is I know this amount went through my bank account on this date. Regardless of which of these lists you do, you can pull up a view that will show you what the transactions are in Xero and what came into your bank account. So in this bank statement view here, I'm going to pick on this one transaction here. If I click on this transaction, it takes me to a view here where it shows me this was my bank statement line. And here are all the lines in Xero. So in my bank statements tab, I'm going to have one line. But in my account transactions tab, I have 7 different lines. So I knew I had received $2,000 into my bank account, which is why I went to the bank statements tab to look for the transaction. If I had searched for $2,000 in my account transactions tab, I wouldn't have found it because all of these transactions here are not 2,000, they just total to it. If, however, the information that I have is in relation to the actual, what I've entered into Xero, I can go to account transactions, find that particular line. So let's pick on this one here, and then go to the view details option that we can see up here. And it will pull up a similar view where it will tell me, right, this is the bank statement line and this is what went into Xero. So just to recap, bank statements are the information that pulls through from your bank account on a daily basis with your bank feeds. Account transactions are all your transactions that have been entered into Xero, regardless of whether they have been matched to a bank feed line or not. If you're searching, figure out which bit of information you know for sure. Is that the Xero transaction or is it the bank feed line? If it's the bank feed line or the line that's on your bank statement, use the bank statement area to search for the transaction. If it's the Xero transaction that you know, use account transactions to search for it and click on view details to see what bank line it was matched to. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to go through is the reconciliation report. So the bank rec report, what this does is it pulls up a list of particular problems that may be in your particular bank statement. These two areas here, so outstanding payments and outstanding receipts, they are payments you've received or payments that have been made that have been manually entered in Xero but not matched to a bank feed line from your bank transactions. So if these are in the future and you know the payments are coming, that's fine. Don't worry about them. If they're in the past, then that tells me there's something wrong and you'll want to do a search in your account transactions window to try and find those problems and work out what's happened with them. The unreconciled bank statement lines, this quite simply are transactions that have come in via your bank feed and you've just not coded them yet. Simple as that. It's just coding that still needs to be done. So this is a problem in your account transactions screen, and this is something to be sorted in your reconcile screen. Generally, what you're hoping you'll get is a bank rec like this, where it will have a balance in Xero and a statement balance. It will obviously not be Xero, but it will be a much bigger value, hopefully. It'll be a different value, but the idea is your balance in Xero and statement balance should always match. You can access that bank rec report straight from your dashboard. You can go to the bank account in question, click on the three dots, and go to the reconciliation report. Or if you're in your coding tab or any of these other tabs along here, it's just clicking on the blue text here for reconciliation report, and that will enable you to run it. Okay, that's everything from within the Xero file. The only other thing that I will add before we get to a question and answer time is you also have the ability to do a lot of coding from within the Xero phone app. So if you haven't already, I would highly recommend that you download the Xero phone app onto your phone and have a look at the coding within there. I am actually running a webinar at the end of May where I'm going to be going through the different Xero phone apps and what you can do with them. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the Xero Business app and what sort of reconciling you can do in there. But a short summary, you can match payments to multiple invoices or bills. You can't do part payments or overpayments, but straight matches can be done. You can code transactions to set code. You can tick it to apply rules or whatever that needs to be. So for your general day-to-day bank rec, it is really easy to whip out your phone, deal with all the easy to manage transactions, and it just saves you some time in front of your computer later on. And if you make a mistake and you click OK when you shouldn't have, you've got the same abilities to fix that transaction as you would have if you had coded it from within Xero